For this level, we're looking at supply chain management. So let's define a couple terms. So when we talk about supply chain, we're talking about the sequence of organizations. So their facilities and activities. So everything that is involved in producing and delivering a product. So we might have one company that is the factory that does the manufacturing. We might have a wholesaler, a distributor, a supplier. And when you're trying to enter new markets like in other countries, then the way to get into those new markets is to add a company to your supply chain, somebody who's familiar with the laws and the customers. So you might choose a distributor and a retailer within that new market. Okay, if you can't produce all of the parts of your product yourself, you might outsource some of that production to another company, in which case part of the manufacturing goes somewhere else, so another factory gets added to your supply chain. And so supply chain is that sequence of organizations. Anyone who you sell your product to that's not the end customer, anyone that you buy your materials from is part of your supply chain. So we need to have supply chain management, and supply chain management is the collaboration and coordination of all those components of your supply chain. And we're going to have that collaboration and coordination so that market demand is met. So that your customers, when they come looking for your product, we have enough on hand and what they want for it to be available for them. And so when we look at supply chain management, really the purpose of supply chain management is to make sure that you're meeting that customer demand as efficiently and effectively as possible. So the purpose of your supply chain is to add value. And so it's often called a value chain instead of being called just a supply chain, because the goal here is to add value throughout the supply chain. So then we need to look at how is value added as a company. How do we add value? And this comes back to those transformations that we discussed earlier this semester. Transformations are how we add value. And there were 6 transformations. Do you remember them from earlier this semester? So there's a physical transformation. Some of the people some of the companies in your supply chain might make the product. So physical is that manufacturing. Okay. Parts of your supply chain might help move the product from one location to another, so locational. Parts of your supply chain, especially your retailers, are going to have an exchange transformation. Their value added is the fact that they are available for the customer to go in and get the product, return it if necessary. They're the one that's working directly with the customer. So you can see in a supply chain, a factory would have the physical transformation. They add value by making the product. Your distributors would be locational, and your retailer would be exchange. You may also have parts of your supply chain that add value through physiological transformations, psychological transformations, and informative. So as you're thinking about who is involved in your supply chain, you want it to be a value chain. Is every company involved in your supply chain, are they adding value? And the question is, how are they adding value? And it's value in the mind of the customer. So you're making the product, are you getting it closer to the product? Are you making it more accessible? How are you adding value to the customer? So if we want to have a value chain where every part of the process adds value, we need to manage our supply chain. And we manage our supply chain so our supply chain can be efficient and effective. When we talk about being efficient, we're talking about reducing cost. Okay? So one reason we might outsource our production is because someone else can do it better, more efficiently than we are. So it saves us money by paying someone who has the greater expertise or economies of scale to do it than to do it in-house. And so it reduces our costs. We also need our supply chain to be effective. So when you manage your supply chain, you need to make sure that that level of quality that you expect, that your customers expect, is throughout the supply chain. So when you are improving the quality of your product, you start with your own company, but you also have to consider the quality throughout the supply chain. Because when the customers look at the product or the experience they're having, they're going to attribute it to you, even if it's your supplier who is the one who is actually creating that level of quality. So we need to have quality and we need to have a timely delivery. So as we look at managing our supply chain, we have to recognize that how we manage our supply chain impacts how we position our company. So think back to earlier in the semester, we talked about the different types of positioning. Positioning is how you choose to have your company compete. So key purchasing criteria, that was in the mind of the customer and how the customer chose you. Positioning is how the company chooses to compete. And there are 4 types of positioning. Do you remember what they were? We have cost. So you could be a low-cost provider like Superstore. You could focus on being the best in quality. And that's how Toyota kind of sees itself in terms of their positioning. Your position could be based on flexibility or variety. So is there customization, lots of different choices. And the last one is delivery. Okay, so if you are a company that like Pizza Hut and you are promising that it's within 30 minutes or it's free, or you are part of a supply chain where you are a distributor, then you're going to position yourself based on delivery so that whenever they place the order, it gets to the next business quickly. So as we look at our supply chain and our attempts to be efficient and effective, we recognize it's going to impact our positioning. If your supply chain isn't able to reduce costs, you can't position your company as a low-cost company. If the factory that is providing the product that you're retailing, if they can't create quality, then you can't position your company as quality. So how you manage your supply chain and who's part of your supply chain is going to impact how you position your company. Now let's look at why we need to manage our supply chain. Okay. There are 5 reasons for why we need to manage our supply chain. So let's start with the first one. The first one is we need to manage our supply chain because we need to manage our inventory. So it has an impact on our company if we have too much or too little inventory. So think about it. What if we have a shortage? What if we don't have enough inventory on hand when our customer comes looking for it? Okay. Well, if we don't have what the customer wants, we may have to pay overtime to get the amount made. We may have to pay to expedite deliveries. We don't have enough in stock here. We need to rush it in from another location or from the manufacturer. if customers come into our store and we don't have what they want, they might get angry and leave and never come back. So the problem with not having enough is it's costly. We either lose the customers or we have to pay extra to get it to the customer. Okay, overtime to make it, expedited deliveries to move it. So having shortages of inventory is expensive. Having a surplus or excess inventory is also expensive. So let's suppose that you manufacture trucks. Okay, if we don't have the trucks that the customers want, we lose their sale. Or we have to pay extra to ship the truck in for the customer. So shortages are expensive. But surpluses are expensive as well, because if we have too many trucks, more trucks than our customers want, then we have to pay to store it all, right? Is your parking lot at your dealership big enough for all of the old trucks as well as the new trucks? And if you have too many old trucks, do you have any space for the new trucks? So it can be costly in terms of storage. It can also be costly in terms of obsolescence. Obsolescence is the fact that the longer your inventory sits there, not only does it depreciate in value, but eventually it has no value at all. Right? If you are selling trucks and you have excess inventory of the 2016 F-150, then as 2017 models come in, as 2018 models come in, nobody wants a 2016 model anymore. You can't get rid of it. You have to mark it down way below cost. So at some point, that inventory becomes obsolete, has no value. And that's very costly to a company to pay to manufacture or buy those materials and then not be able to recoup any of the money for it. So having shortages are expensive, having surpluses are expensive. And having a bullwhip, which is where you basically swing back and forth between shortages and surpluses, is also very expensive. So let's define the bullwhip effect and look at the impact of it in more detail. So the bullwhip effect is demand variability, which increases as we move further from the customer. So what we look at is the bullwhip effect looks at this big swing between shortages and surpluses, and the swing gets bigger the farther down the supply chain you are away from the customer. So we define that as demand variability increases as information moves through the supply chain towards the factory. So the factory, which is the furthest away from the customer, if we look back, for example, at this supply chain, here's your end customer, here's your retailers, distributors, manufacturers, suppliers. The further away you are from that end customer, the more you're going to feel this bullwhip effect, this variability in the orders that come in. And you're going to have too much, then too little. It's going to create shortages and surpluses. So let's take a look at the bullwhip effect, the impact it has, and what causes it. So let's look at an example of the bullwhip effect. All right, so let's suppose here we have our retailers, our wholesalers, and our producers. So the retailer, of course, is the closest to the customer, and they know what the customer wants. So there's very little variability in what the orders are, right? They have direct contact with the customer, and the customer's demand isn't changing very much. But as you get further away from the customer, you start to see much more variability in orders. So the retailer has to order materials from the wholesaler. So for example, if this is the Gap that sells t-shirts, they have to order those t-shirts from a wholesaler. So the Gap is placing orders to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler then, when they receive those orders are going to start to vary more than the retailer who's having direct contact with the customer. the wholesaler has to place orders with the producer, whatever company is making the t-shirts. And since the wholesaler does not have direct contact with the customer, they're having to kind of make a guess as to how much the customer is going to, they have to forecast that demand, how much the customer is going to want. And so the amount they order from the producer is going to start to see even more variability than closer to the customer. So the bullwhip effect, we can see if we overlay the retailer orders, the wholesaler orders, and the producer orders. So let me just pull up Excel here. So let's suppose that here we have time, so weeks 1 through 21, and then we have our factory, we have our distributor, our wholesaler, and our retailer. So you can see the retailer, who's in direct contact with the customer, they mostly have demand 5 units a week, and then there's an uptick in week 6, and then it goes back in week 14 back to 5. The wholesaler is going to be placing orders from the distributor in order to meet the demand of the retailer. So as we work backwards, the retailer is going to buy product from the wholesaler is going to get it from the distributor, and the distributor is going to get it from the factory. Well, if we overlay the orders on a graph where we can see, so here's a time chart, so we can see over time, you can see the retailer here in blue has very little change in its demand. The wholesaler, they start to increase their orders in anticipation that the retailer might need more. And then what happens is the distributor starts to see that the wholesaler needs more, and they anticipate they might need more from the factory. And the factory then thinks, oh, we're going to need even more. And so you start to see this wave where everybody's increasing their orders and increasing their inventory. But then what happens is that everybody then has too much inventory for the amount that they actually need. So then when they place orders in the subsequent weeks, they don't order as much. So you see a big drop in the number of orders because they had excess inventory. Well, when they do that, they drop the number of orders and they start to use up all that inventory. They suddenly swing the other direction and they now have a shortage, not enough inventory. And so then they start to increase their orders for inventory, and then it swings back up again, where then they have too much, and back and forth. So this bullwhip effect shows that if there's basically this kind of ripple effect, the further you are away from the customer, the more you're going to see this exaggeration in terms of too much inventory and too little. And notice how it progresses. It starts with the wholesaler, then the distributor, then the factory, then everyone starts to pull back, and then it ramps back up again. So if you think about a bullwhip, okay, if you slapped a whip, that kind of wiggle that happens, that's what we're seeing here on the graph. Okay, demand variability. And the demand variability increases the further you are away from the customer, and you can kind of see that ripple effect here. We're swinging from having too much inventory to too little. You can see the bullwhip effect also not only with your orders, but also with the inventory levels and with your costs. Your costs will keep going up, 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 because both having too much and too little will make the costs go up. All right, so let's go back to our notes. And now that we understand kind of what the bullwhip effect is, and in class, we'll do an activity where you can feel the bullwhip effect. But let's talk about what impact that bullwhip effect has on your company. So we said the bullwhip effect is that big variability, too much, too little, back and forth. So this creates a lot of problems for your company. The first problem it creates is you have high inventory levels, right? You have too much inventory because you don't know how much you're going to need, so you order extra just in case, which then jacks up the costs, right? Because now you have to store that inventory, and remember that if you have too much inventory, you have storage costs, you have obsolescence costs, So it gets expensive. Okay, so then what you do is you order less inventory because you have too much, and then what happens is we end up being back ordered. We don't have enough on hand. So when the customer comes in looking for the product, you can't provide it, so then we have low service levels. Service level looks at what percentage of the time do you have enough, right? If we don't have enough, we then have to back order for it. And that has an impact, right? And it's very costly because if you don't have enough, you have to pay overtime for production, expedited deliveries, and you lose customers. So in order to make sure that you have enough inventory on hand, you'll do things like increase your capacity, right? Let's produce more for those periods of time where we need to have more inventory. And then there's other times where nobody is ordering anything from you because now that everyone has too much inventory, nobody's placing orders with your company, and so you don't need to make anything. So what happens is you start to get poor capacity utilization. Okay, so it's a period of time where the orders have dropped, we're not making anything, and our factory is sitting idle. Okay? So these high demand fluctuations cause problems. Too much inventory, not enough, both are expensive. And if you're not consistently making units, then you're going to have poor utilization. So when there's big variability in the demand for your product, you try to protect yourself, of course, by making sure you have adequate shipping capacity, right? Because we might have to expedite a delivery and send a bunch of units all at once. So I need bigger trucks. Oh, well, we might get a huge order, so I better have more production capacity. I need to be able to make more all at once. I need more raw materials just in case. And so all of these mean increased capacity, but because of the variability, you're not utilizing these capacities and you get low utilization. Because you need the big capacity when there's that high demand, but you don't need it on the other side of that bullwhip effect. Most of the time, this capacity is going to be idle. Okay, so it's also going to cost you money. So when we look at bullwhip effect, you can see here, has the retailer in red, the wholesaler in yellow. So notice how the variability moves through the supply chain, is biggest for those farthest away from the customer, and everyone's getting more inventory just in case, and then they have too much inventory, and so they drop how much they order by quite a bit, and then they don't have enough, and then they have back orders. And so the high orders lead to a response which is, well, let's make sure we have greater capacity for those high orders, but then most of the time, you don't have those high orders. You're sitting idle, low utilization, and so on. So what could cause this? What causes this big variability? Well, there's a number of causes that can create this bullwhip effect. Now, the first one, it was related to demand forecasting. So let's suppose that you do a poor job of forecasting customer demand. Okay, so you're the factory and you're trying to determine how much customers are going to need of the shirts that you make. So that'll tell you how much the Gap is going to order from the wholesaler, and the wholesaler will order from the distributor, and how much the distributor is going to order. How much they're going to order from you. So in this case, you're trying to forecast demand, but if you don't accurately forecast demand, you may increase production when there's not an increase in demand. So now you have too much inventory. And then you have too much inventory taking up too much space. So in that case, you produce less, And then if your demand is not correct, then you won't have enough. And so it creates this instability because you're producing too much or too little. If you have high lead times, so in your supply chain, okay, so here's the parts of your supply chain. The lead time is the time between when you place an order and when it arrives. Okay, so if you place an order as the retailer, if it takes a long time between when you place the order and when you get it, then what you're going to do to protect yourself is you're going to tend to order a lot more. Okay, so you're going to start ordering large quantities every time you place the order because it takes a long time for it to get back and you need to make sure you have enough while you're waiting for your order to arrive. So what happens then is you order a big quantity and then there's a couple weeks where you don't order anything and then you order a big quantity again. And so what happens then is that means that further up the supply chain they get a big order and then they don't get an order for a couple days, so big order, and then no orders for a couple days, and then another big order. These batch orders that we do when there's high lead time or when we wait for sales and we buy large quantities all at once create a lot of instability in production and it has a ripple effect all the way through the supply chain. Okay. So if we were to look at an example of that, let's look at a co-op. So at co-op, they sell these birdseed cakes. So these birdseed cakes, they're like $8 a piece, and they come from a company, called Pine Tree Farms. So here's the seed cakes at Pine Tree Farms. The problem is that when co-op buys them, there's a long lead time. They don't quite know when they're going to arrive. So co-op doesn't know if when they place the order, I believe this company is in New York, when they place the order for these seed cakes, if it's going to take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So what happens is they order a big batch so that they hope they can have enough until the next order comes in. Well, what happens is the customers, they see that for weeks and weeks, there's no seed cakes. The second they show up, the customers say, well, who knows when the next batch will come in, so I'm going to buy everything they have. So the customer will buy, the entire flat of seed cakes because it could be weeks, it could be a month, it could be even longer before the next one comes in, so they take everything. Well, then co-op says, oh, look how great they're selling. We need to order more. So the next time they order from the Pine Tree Farms, they order an even bigger batch. Okay? And what happens is the orders just keep escalating and bigger because no one knows when the product's going to come in. And so everyone keeps grabbing everything there is. And then there's long periods of time where there's nothing to sell. And so each part of the supply chain feels the need to buy a bigger batch to protect them from the lack of product in the future. And you can see how it kind of just escalates. Co-op then has to buy more. The customers go weeks without it, so they then buy more when they come, and then the next customer shows up and there's nothing, so that when the customer does see one, they buy everything. And so what we get is this real instability in the demand for the products, the amount of orders that we're placing, or the size of the orders we're placing, and it creates this huge variability in terms of how much do we produce, how much do we ship, and creates a lot of instability and costs for every part of the supply chain. All right, so let's go back to our notes. So the bullwhip effect is created by poor demand forecasting, high lead times, and batch ordering. So high lead times can lead to batch orders. So can when you have discounts. So if parts of your supply chain are waiting until things go on sale, then that can also lead to batch orders. So a big amount all at once and then nothing for a period of time and a big order again. It makes it really hard to predict how much to produce. Other price fluctuations, if you are waiting until it's cheap, you stock up and the price goes up and then you wait again. So we get inflated orders. We order too much. We don't know if it's going to be enough, so we stock up and then we have too much and then we don't buy for a while until that dwindles and then we buy a lot again. So when we talk about the bullwhip effect, having too much than too little, if you don't have that nice steady orders because you don't know what the customer wants, so you're stocking up just in case. If you're trying to buy it when it's super cheap, if you're uncertain about delivery, so you're going to get it as much as you can now because you don't know when the next shipment comes in, or you're buying in big batches, then there's periods where we have a huge amount of inventory and then not enough, and then huge amount of inventory again. And remember, too much inventory and too little can be very expensive. So when it comes to the need for supply chain management, we need to manage our inventory. We don't want to have too much, we don't want to have too little, and we don't want the bullwhip effect where we swing back and forth between too much and too little. The second reason we need to manage our supply chain is because we need to improve operations. So after you improve your own operations, so you've made your company more efficient, you've increased your quality, then you need to work on those areas with your supply chain because the customer doesn't differentiate between the different parts of your supply chain. For example, if we look at Apple and iPhone, there were accusations that Foxconn provided poor working conditions for those who made the iPhone. Well, nobody knows who Foxconn is. No one blames them. We blame Apple. Just like if we go back a decade or two, scandals with Nike and producing shoes in Eastern Asia, and the accusations there are poor working conditions. They're part of your supply chain. So ultimately, what happens with those companies in terms of reputation, in terms of cost, in terms of quality, will impact the reputation of your company. It'll impact your costs and the quality of your product. So you improve operations throughout your supply chain, which is why you need to manage the supply chain. The third reason you need to manage your supply chain is because of increasing levels of outsourcing. So outsourcing is when you purchase goods and services from an outside supplier. So you outsource parts of your production if they can do it better than you. They have the expertise you don't. They can do it for cheaper than you can. And that may be because they have economies of scale, so they're producing larger quantities, and so they have a lower cost per unit than you would. So you outsource when someone else can do it for cheaper. So we need to decide, when do we outsource? So let's look at an example. All right, well, let's reload this page and then we can look at an example. All right, so level. So let's suppose you run a school cafeteria. And the school cafeteria, you can make your own pizza for 30 cents a slice. The cost of kitchen and labor will be $200 a day. Or we could outsource the manufacturing of pizza to, let's say, Buster's Pizza, and let's say they can deliver for $9 a pizza. There's 8 slices in a pizza, and the cost of labor is $75 per day. We need to figure out, should we insource, that is make it ourselves, or should we outsource? Well, to figure out if we should make it ourselves or whether we should outsource, we need to compare the cost. So what is the cost to make our own pizza? Well, it's going to be 30 cents a slice times whatever our demand is, plus the $200 of labor and kitchen. In comparison, when we look at Buster's Pizza, it's going to be $9 a pizza, and there's 8 slices per pizza. So $9 divided by 8 tells us the cost per slice. And that we're going to multiply then times the number of slices that we sell, plus our labor of $75 a day. So if our forecasted demand is 120 slices per day, then the cost to make it ourselves is 30 cents times 120 plus 200. So it costs us $236 to make it ourselves. If we outsource it, then it'll be 9 divided by 8 times the forecasted demand of 120 slices plus $75, which equals $210. So should we make the pizza ourselves or should we outsource it? Well, it's cheaper to outsource it to Buster's Pizza, so we would go with that. When you are deciding whether or not to outsource, you'll notice that this cost analysis is very dependent on forecasted demand. So it's very important that you have a good forecast to be able to make the appropriate decision. So we said there were a total of 5 reasons that we need to manage our supply chain. We need to manage our inventories. We need to improve our overall operations, which includes the rest of our supply chain. We need to consider outsourcing. And we need to consider the fact that there's increased globalization. So with globalization, the supply chains are getting longer. So you have more companies involved in your supply chain. When you buy raw materials from other countries, when you want to sell into a different country, you now need additional companies to be involved. And as the supply chain gets longer and longer, it's more important that it be well managed. We also need supply chain management because of the increase in e-commerce. So we look at e-commerce, we're looking at the use of computers to conduct buying and selling. So with e-commerce, with the fact that customers can buy online, that means that we now have more competition, and it becomes more important to have fast delivery and to be responsive to our customers. And so we need to have a well-managed supply chain so that we can get what the customer wants when they want it, and so that we don't lose customers because we don't have what they want.